What's up, guys? Coming to you, want to talk to you about Brandon Sanderson novels. So, I'm going to be doing a little different today, because obviously these are novels and not comic books or superhero related, but I think if you've been around for a little while, you probably know that we talk about all sorts of random stuff here that's sci-fi and fantasy and stuff. But anyways, so I'm going to be comparing the two and why I like one over the other. But I should say, like, I've read Elantris and I've read Mistborn: The Final Empire, but I have not read the sequels to the first Mistborn. So this is purely unbiased, based on the entire trilogy of Mistborn. It's one-on-one. These are actually the only books that I've read from him, and I literally just read them. And by read, I mean Audible, because Audible is so awesome. And no, they're not a sponsor, because that would mean I'd probably have a better YouTube channel. But but I can't love Audible enough. I found out that I can listen to books on Audible at work, and it's pretty sweet. And so I listened to the Silmarillion first as a side note, and then I listened to Elantris, and then I listened to Mistborn and the Final Empire, and man, they're so good. All three of them, loved all. But let's talk about these two. So first I'll talk about what I like about them each individually, and then I'll talk more about why I like one over the other. So the first one is Elantris. I listened to that first. It was my first Brandon Sanderson book. I finished it, I think, either this past week, beginning of this week, or end of last week. I can't remember which. Although I was immediately annoyed that there wasn't a sequel, at least not a true sequel. And because I love this book. It was so good. And so this book, it's got it switches it. From what I heard on Audible, I don't know about how it's written, but as far as the Audible version, the audiobook, it starts with Raoden in chapter 1, and then goes to Sereni, the next book or chapter, and then every third chapter is Wraithen, and spelled with an H. It's hard to hear, so I had to look it up later. But anyways, I'll tell you. So one of the only problems I had with the book is I wasn't really super interested in every third chapter, as in Wraithen. I didn't really care for the character. He worked as a great villain, and I enjoyed him in his dealings against Sereni. I thought those were really fun. But every time I got to his chapter, I was just like, I'm ready for the next one. Like, can I just skip this chapter and move on to the next one? And thankfully, I didn't, and I just kept pressing forward. But I think what really made me love this book is the idea of Elantris itself. It was really intriguing. The way it's written, I think he described it as how did he say? It's a city prison where they throw zombie lepers. Of course, I'm not a big zombie guy, so if I had heard that description before, I probably wouldn't have read it first. But just the description of these people in the very first chapter in Elantris. And so if you haven't read it, basically they're people who their skin turns, they get black splotches, their skin starts to fade, and they lose their strength, and they basically die. Their body stops healing, and so every injury that they receive causes immense pain, and it's constant for the rest of their existence, which is never ending because they don't know how to die. And so they're in constant pain forever, and they only accumulate pain, and the more they get, eventually their mind snaps from the pain and they go mad. And it's very interesting. And so when Raoden is thrown in, because he becomes an Elantrian, his first goal is to make a better life for the people in Elantris once he kind of figures out what's going on, before time runs out and his mind snaps and he becomes one of the people who've gone mad. And so really great. And there's these gangs that are there of people just trying to survive, and he has to face each one of them. And man, it's so good. It's written so well. Meanwhile, every second chapter has Serene, and was supposed to be Raoden's wife, a political marriage, and she's described as having this being her last chance for marriage because of her age, and so she makes it to the city where she would be married, and finds that Raoden is dead. He's become an Elantrian, but she doesn't find that part out. She just is told that he's dead. And so, because of the political marriage, the contract says that she's immediately married upon his death. And so she has to stay in that city as long as her father, the king, is alive. As in her father-in-law, the king. And so she's stuck husbandless in this new city that she doesn't know, and she has to learn it all. And her extended family is part of what makes this series great. And I really love her interacting with her uncle and aunt and her cousins. It's great. And also surprise ending with her one of her cousins. Loved it. I'll talk about more in spoiler section, but and then you got Hrathen. He's a priest of a religion that worships this god named Jedith, and he's been told that he has to convert. It might be a little bit later in the series, but he's told that he has to convert the people of this kingdom and Serene's old former kingdom, or they'll all be destroyed. And so he's trying to save them. Meanwhile, they know that the last city that he came to was brutally destroyed, and so Serene is fighting against him politically to save their cities from being overrun by this bad religion. And it's very interesting. Now I love politics. I keep it off my channel most of the time because I just want to be more positive. And that's the opposite of politics. But this series is good, or this book is good. I really enjoyed it. So that's Elantris. Really excellent. There's some magic I didn't mention. Former Elantrians, before they became this decrepit people, they were basically kind of like elves. They got silver skin, and they were stronger, faster. They had all types of magic, and they were able to, provide for the world around them without really having to labor. They could just use magic for everything, and it was really cool. Like, they had to draw the magic in the air. I really liked that idea for magic. All right, so that's Elantris. I guess if I had to say, there's the only bad thing that I had for Elantris, the only thing that took me out of the book the most, more than Hrathen. Like, I thought his storyline did it really need its own chapters, but some of it was okay. Really, the only time I liked his chapters were when Raoden or Serena were in it. But by himself, I didn't really find him as interesting a character. But the other thing is, Sanderson uses certain words that kind of took me out of the fantasy. It's hard to explain, but there's some words that just don't really fit the genre, and a lot of them come from like modern day America, or the modern day of the Western world, like post-Enlightenment, and it just doesn't really fit in a fantasy world that's supposed to be like pre-Enlightenment, because you kind of think of fantasy world as like Middle Ages kind of era where you got knights and lords and kings and nobles and servants and stuff like that. It's kind of a more middle-aged kind of era. But then when you get to the Enlightenment, you're using words that are, built 1,000 years later or hundreds of years later, and that some of those words just don't fit in a story based in like an older era. So it kind of like some of those words just took me out of them. Like that's like 100 years later before anybody would ever come up with that word. It didn't really feel natural in the story, and there were a bunch of them in Elantris that just kind of took me out of the story. I was like, that's an odd word for them to be using. You could have used other words which would have made it more laborious to explain, but would have fit the genre a lot better than a more modern term. So that was my biggest critique of it. Even Herodin, not Herodin, it's Rathan and Rodin put together. Even Herathan was easier to handle than these words that just didn't fit the genre. Don't give me an example, or don't ask me for an example, because it's been a week since I listened to it. But I love the book. It's now one of my favorite books. Can't talk highly enough of it. So, Mistborn, The Final Empire. It's the first one in the Mistborn series, a trilogy. I don't really know how many books there are in this series, but I think that's a trilogy. There might be some others that kind of take place after. I don't know. I'm just getting into Brandon Sanderson myself. Mistborn, I'll say that, we'll talk about it. So, it's about this girl who grows up in this world. I think it's been described as like the bad guy one, and so like he's the ruler overall. But she's in the slums. She's of the race of people that are enslaved, that are the lower tier people, and she's in one of these. She's kind of gotten out of like the labor camps and become in one of these thieving dens. So some of the more powerful of the lower class become thieves, basically, and in this kingdom, and they live in hideouts and stuff, and they're just filled rife with atrocities and bad things against their own people, stealing from the rich, and very immoral. But she grows up. Her brother has betrayed her by the time the book starts, and he's told her that everybody will betray you in the end, and so she has to live with this, where she can't trust anybody. She lives in fear of she's constantly being beaten by the people in the thieving group, or the crew, and she's, has to fear being raped because she's a woman in this area. They talk about how there's not a lot of women thieves because they usually end up as prostitutes, and just really, really interesting setting. Perhaps we'll talk about it in a little bit, but she ends up being pulled out of this crew by another man who is also a Ska, is the name of the people in the lower class, named Kelsier, and she is pulled out by him, and he runs his own crew, but he runs it very differently, where he trusts people. And so a lot of the book is really her learning to trust people, and it's really interesting. I really like that character dynamic. But she also learns that she is what they call Mistborn, and so it's a magic user type that they swallow metals, sometimes in the water, sometimes with water, and different metals give you different powers. I kept thinking like I wanted like a pure telekinesis, but it's not really how this magic system works, which is fine. But it was really interesting, like very different from what I'm used to for magic systems, but it was really cool nonetheless. And so they had to consume fires while it was in their system, or consume metals while it was in their system. They call it burning the metal. And different metals, of course, gave them different powers, and it was really cool. I really enjoyed that system. So they she joins this team. She's learning to trust these people because they work together via trust while she's being trained how to be a Mistborn. And so she gets thrown into this life of being a noble woman, and so she goes to all these balls with all the other nobles undercover for the sake of the mission that this crew has taken on, which is to overthrow the Lord Ruler and free the sky, and take down the nobility. So the last character that really it's important is the guy she falls in love with in the ball setting. She becomes more and more used to being a noble woman, going to lots of parties and balls. She falls in love with this guy named Elantris, and he is the heir to the biggest noble house. And so, really interesting stuff. I really like all the intrigue, all the world building that he does in this. Feels like a much bigger world than Elantris did. And so a lot of the characters are very personable, and you really get, I feel like in this book, like the characters come more alive than some of the ones did in Elantris, and maybe that's just because they do more. Like each person in the crew has different parts to play. They have different qualities, and so like some of the ones in Elantris, because I was listening to it, blur together a little bit, and so it was just another one of the people with Serene. That near the end, you've kind of gotten used, or just listening, I kind of got used to who was who, but even then, they still didn't play like a huge role separately, except for her uncle. But the other noblemen kind of blur together a little bit. But with Mistborn, the Final Empire, everybody on the crew has their own part to play. They're very distinct characters, and they all have different roles in what they do, and a lot of it has to do with the metals themselves. And so, just really, really great. Now, the only problem I had with this book, there was only one or two words in the entire book that really took me out of it. There were a few that were borderline, but I was like, okay, this is a different world than Elantris. I was like, okay, it kind of more fits into a metallic world where metal is a very big proponent of the world. So there were a few that I kind of questioned when I heard them, and I was like, okay, that it does make sense. And so later it didn't bother me, but there were a couple words that really just threw me off. I don't remember what they were, but so that wasn't really a big problem in this book. Again, that's with fantasy. In some genres, they don't really have as big a problem with certain words being out of place, but in fantasy, throwing modern words into it just kind of throws you out of it. Okay, here's an example. It's not in these books, but imagine like Tolkien's Lord of the Rings. They started talking about cell phones. Like, well, they wouldn't have any idea what a cell phone is in that world. Even the word cell doesn't really fit, because cell is something that isn't really figured out until like the Enlightenment. So what is a cell? Other than like a jail cell. Anyways, so that's what I'm talking about. Words that don't really fit in the genre. But Mistborn didn't really have that problem for the most part. My problem with Mistborn is the middle section of the book. When Ven, the hero, she is going to all these balls, it gets really boring. And I told one of my friends, I was like, honestly, if I wasn't listening on Audible rather than reading, because I'm a horrible reader, I'm a better listener. if I wasn't listening to it, I would have not finished this book because of the midsection. It just it didn't have enough intrigue to keep me reading, and so I felt like some of the chapters didn't end really with a good question to keep me hooked, and so it was difficult. But thankfully, I kept reading because the ending is incredible. He masterfully gets you to the lowest of lows where you feel like they're defeated, and then raises you up to the top, and you're like, wow, how? And it's so good. It's so good. There's a lot of questions that I have that I just wonder if we're ever going to get an answer to. And so I was listening to another YouTuber talk about this book, and she was talking about how there's so many questions that don't get answered until later. And I think that's really well done. I hate it for Elantris because there was never a proper sequel that really could answer half the questions. But with this one, like, I know there's other books. I was like, okay, so they'll answer those. So Elantris versus Mistborn, I side with Elantris. I really love the book. There was rarely a chapter that didn't keep me going, and even the ones with Hrathen that I didn't really quite enjoy as much, I kept reading because I was ready to get to the next chapter. The next every chapter with Raoden was excellent. I loved every one of them. I just wanted to learn more about Elantris and more about this mystery disease, and even Serene. Like, I wanted to see what plots and ploys she was going to use to protect the kingdom. And so even though like every third chapter was a little bit harder to bear most of the time, some of them were really good, but most of the time, even though those were weaker and there were words thrown in that kind of took me out of the world, the story of most of the book was just captivating for me. Now with Mistborn, the very beginning, the first third of the book, just excellent. I really enjoyed it. It took me a little while because I was a little depressed that there wasn't a sequel for Elantris. But I got over it. And once he starts introducing the metals, I was like, okay, that's pretty cool. And so I just got used to, or I started, once Kelsier gets into the book, I really enjoyed, I mean, it really just started clicking for me. And then all the way up into where she gets used to going to the balls, I was like, great, we got another story about a ball. Like, and so I liked the romance between her and Elend, but Vin and Elend, but those scenes, like, that was the only part that I really enjoyed of those the middle third of the book. I just drug along. I was just like, I'm ready. Like, is this how it's going to end? Like, I'm ready for some action. I'm ready for something. Like, Elantris has very little action in it. And it's amazing how invested I was in the book without action. But Mistborn, the middle third, has very little action in it. And I wasn't interested in half of what was going on. I was like, this is dragging. And so some people have said the pacing is off, which I guess you could use that word if you wanted to for it. It drug along. It didn't get to where I wanted it. There were a lot of things that probably could have been cut out and skipped over, but I kept going. And the last third is just excellent, where he unravels everything. He explains everything that's going on. A lot of the twists and turns that you thought were going to happen don't happen, and other twists happen unexpectedly, and you're like, wow, that's so good. So just excellent book. I really enjoyed it. And I will say I like Elantris better. It was a lot more engaging for me. I really, really want to see more from the magic of Elantris. The writing magic is just, for me, a lot more interesting than the metals, even though I really like the metals. And I'll probably do a video about the two sequels for Mistborn, and so you can see what I think once I know anything about them. Maybe my opinion will change. I'll be like, okay, yeah, this series is better. But those are my thoughts. I really liked Elantris. I really liked the the Final Kingdom, or the Final Empire. So if you've read them, let me know. Let me know what you thought. If you haven't, go read them. They're really good. They're both excellent books. Some of the best books I've read. Of course, I listened to them, but still, go read or listen to them. And thank you, Audible. Like, I know that I don't have any kind of formal connection with them, but I am a consumer, and I love their books. Listening to their books. So just two really great books. I recommend both of them. Let me know what you thought. If you're new here, go ahead and subscribe. I'd love for you. Join the family. We talk a lot of sci-fi stuff, a lot of fantasy, comic books, anything that me and Lewis are interested in. So like Star Wars. So thanks for watching. Give us a like if you enjoyed the video. Leave us a comment if you want to talk about anything about that. I'd love to. Just mark things as spoilers if you're going to spoil it, and please don't spoil the second two books for me, because I want to listen to them in the next couple weeks. So catch you next time. Peace.